Hello. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Hello, everybody. So, one of my favorite features of Bitcoin, it's relatively unknown, not that many people are aware of it, is that it exposes incentives. It doesn't matter whether you're an individual, a government, a company, doesn't matter. Bitcoin shines a light of truth on incentive structures. And if those incentive structures are corrupt, you're probably not going to like this thing at all. So as someone who covers the news daily, Alex, your proof of work on exposing some of these institutions has played a pivotal role in not only my understanding of the IMF, but on the importance of Bitcoin as an alternative to the people that do not have the financial privilege that a lot of us in the West take for granted. Thank God for Bitcoin. So, Alex, I'm going to start off with the mandate on the IMF's website, and I want to get your thoughts on it. So, quote, "The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank share a common goal of raising living standards in their member countries. The IMF promotes global macroeconomic financial stability and provides policy advice to help countries build and maintain strong economies." What are the actual goals of the IMF and the World Bank, Alex?
So you have to go back to 1944. The IMF and World Bank were pillar institutions of what was known as Bretton Woods. The US and the Allies were winning World War II, and they gathered at a hotel in New Hampshire to sort of figure out what the new international monetary order would be. And they wanted two kind of, again, pillar institutions to help shape that order. One of them would be the IMF. So the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, would be the world's lender of last resort. And until 1971, what it focused on was keeping exchange rate stability. So you had the new system where the dollar was backed by gold, redeemable at $35 per ounce of gold, and then other countries pegged their currency systems accordingly. What the designers did not want in this sort of neoliberal structure, they did not want world trade to be disrupted. They needed that to flow so that these resources could flow, so the spice could flow, right? They did not want obstacles in that. So they didn't want what happened in the 1930s to happen again, which was like a breakdown in trade, autarky, etc. So when a country started to have a balance of payments issue and its currency started to devalue past where what was acceptable, the idea was that the IMF could come in and stabilize them. It was basically seen as like a stabilization fund. So, I don't think that it's like long-term outcomes were designed at the start. I don't think, people got together in a room and said, let's exploit poor countries. I don't think that's what it was created to do. But when Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard in 71, like that mandate kind of disappeared, and a lot of economists said, well, why do we still have the IMF? We no longer need to peg exchange rates to gold. Like now we all have floating exchange rates. So the point of the IMF was called into question, and it kind of pivoted to a new, let's say, mission, and that was to basically stabilize and bail out countries in the developing world. That's kind of how it shifted its mission over time. Same thing with the World Bank. The World Bank started off as the world's largest development bank. It was supposed to fund projects that private capital didn't want to support in war-torn Europe and Japan primarily. And, by the early 70s, it had largely achieved that mission. Those countries were industrial powers again and could no longer really be considered like war-torn developing countries. So it also shifted its mission largely to start focusing on what we call the global south or the third world, et cetera, basically the 6.7 or so billion people who live outside of like what we would consider advanced industrial economies. So these institutions were set up to do one thing, and then they kind of transformed into another thing. And the thesis of my book is that other thing that they started to do was basically replicate colonial dynamics of siphoning and draining resources and labor from poor countries to rich countries, which was really essential over, originally with colonialism. That was sort of the point of colonialism, was to supplement, whether it was British society or French society or Spanish society, with gold and oil and stuff from elsewhere. I mean, you go back to the conquistadors, you go back to British India. The whole point was to like have London and Madrid or Paris or Berlin, etc., to raise the standard of living there by subsidizing it with cheap goods and labor from elsewhere. That was kind of the whole point of colonialism. So that broke down, caused a lot of issues, actually. So I know people talk about why did we have the Great Depression in the 30s, and I think obviously it's fair to look at the monetary system at the time, and some people say it's because we left the gold standard, and some people say it's because we didn't leave it soon enough. There's obviously a big debate there. But what too few people say is that it's because colonialism was breaking down. So this like conveyor belt of resources that the crown jewel of the Western financial system, Britain, had for a long time, coming from British India, started to break down, and that caused like large inflationary issues in the West. Same thing in the 70s. You used to have a situation where Western companies called the Seven Sisters controlled oil production around the world in a large way. After the 60s and the end of colonialism, in a formal way, OPEC now controlled the production of oil. And then what you saw was, again, inflationary stuff in the West. OPEC decided to raise the price of oil. We no longer controlled those resources. So we started having inflation. And now today you're seeing something similar where you have this global system where we're all interconnected. It's starting to sort of break down in some areas, and you're seeing some inflationary pressures again. So, like, the whole system has been designed to keep inflation down at home so that democratic societies don't like rise up and overthrow the government, which happens all the time, of course, and elsewhere, by like sort of subsidizing our way of life with cheap resources and labor. And that, like, just to put a statistic on it, there was a study done in 2015, and that year, let's say the rich countries, 50% of our resources and about a third of our labor came from the global south. So just do a thought experiment. Say tomorrow, let's say we woke up and no longer had that. What would that look like? Like, what would our society look like if we had half of the precious metals, rare earths, fossil fuels, gold, all kinds of things, food, etc. And then think about what would happen if the cheap end of our labor spectrum was just gone. So you had to replace that with people who make a lot more money, like in the United States. We'd have massive inflation, right? So again, this is easy to see. Like, the whole system is about bringing cheap stuff from abroad here, and it was supplemented more recently by basically bringing China into this system, like 22 years ago. So all of a sudden now you had, us relying on cheap labor in China, which has obviously its own host of problems. But that's kind of the backdrop of the thesis of my book, is that the Western financial system, especially post-71 in the fiat era, has grown to basically replicate a lot of colonial dynamics of what's called unequal exchange.
Yeah, and that reminds me of one of the quotes from the book. You said, quote, "Between the 1920s and 1960s, political colonialism became virtually extinct. Post-1960, this became the new function for the World Bank and IMF, recreating the colonial drain from the poor countries to rich countries that was once maintained by straightforward imperialism." And I guess to follow up that, Argentina is currently enduring 100% inflation. Last year, the IMF offered them another bailout. But what was curious about that bailout is that one of the clauses in that bailout said that they had to de-incentivize the adoption of Bitcoin. Now we know that's not really working, but what are your thoughts on that? Why would they add that clause?
Well, the whole point is to have a captive audience, is to have, like, I mean, the designers of these plans are looking at citizens like farm animals. They're like, we need to keep them in this pen. It's like, we don't want them to escape. So they don't want capital to flee. They don't want capital to escape. And a lot of times, the goal is to basically force the local population to use like a really bad fiat currency that can be manipulated. So, for example, in Egypt right now, they're undergoing IMF structural adjustment, which I cover in my book, and it's basically a process where when the IMF grants a loan to a poor country or a poor nation, that nation not only has to pay high interest rates and give up control over certain aspects of its economy, but it also has to fulfill certain conditions. And those conditions are often like higher taxes, a shrinking banking, a smaller banking system, devaluation of the currency, end to any sort of subsidy on energy or food, et cetera, et cetera. So basically just like causing a recession, basically, and collapsing the currency. So Currently, what you're seeing in Egypt right now, largest country in the Arab world, is like a skyrocketing cost of living due to the devaluation of the currency. So people are like able to buy a lot less bread than before with the same amount of hours of labor. That's the idea behind this system, is wage deflation. Like we want to, again, protect wages over here by causing them to go down over here. So it allows us to squeeze out more value from these countries because with a weaker currency, the people can afford less, but it means the exports are cheaper for us to acquire, right? So when we talk about all the minerals and natural resources that we want for our societies, if these countries have a weaker currency, it means that we can get that stuff for cheaper, right? So that's like kind of the point of the system. So for Argentina, they've been adjusted so many times, and the biggest targets of like structural adjustment are usually not little tiny countries. They're usually like pretty big, like global South powers. So we're talking here Indonesia, Argentina, Brazil, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Pakistan. I mean, these are big countries with a lot of natural resources. So these tend to be at the high end of the target list. I mean, if you're like Bhutan or Malawi, I mean, you're probably not at the top of the target list for the IMF because there's only so much they could squeeze out of you, right? Like you're not like, but these big countries that have a lot of natural resources, very appealing for Mexico, very appealing for the IMF. So they would go in there and lend enormous amounts of money. And, it's interesting. There's a lot of people who criticize the IMF and World Bank. They say, well, they're bureaucratic or wasteful. And look, they end up damaging, some of the society in these countries. But they don't see the benefit. Like, they don't see that it's actually really lucrative for us. And it's lucrative in three ways. Number one, interest. Again, these aren't charitable institutions. They make a lot of money, billions of dollars a year on interest, on a flow of interest payments, which are dollar denominated and which are always sort of the first thing that a country has to pay when it goes to pay its national bill at the end of the year and the month or week or whatever it's doing. It takes precedence over funding education or healthcare or whatever, or food for the local population. They have to pay the debt back first. So interest payments are number one. Number two, again, as we've covered, cheap resources and labor. Number three is control. Like basically, again, like because of the conditionality of the loans, we can shape these countries to become dependent on us for food and to make the things that we want them to make. So like they end up not like creating their own industries, right? They end up not being like industrial powers. They tend to not make cars or airplanes, for example, or high-tech computing. They export raw goods to us: tin, bauxite, lumber, oil, etc. And then we like manufacture, refine, etc. And then we often sell back that stuff to them. So they have cars, obviously. It's just the cars are usually not made in those countries. So this is development, is the point of the book, and development's been very harmful, in my opinion.
So around the same time that the IMF included that clause, right, and
Sorry, to finish the point, obviously, Bitcoin and like from what I've seen, stable coins, like they allow people to escape. And if you were being structurally adjusted in Peru in the 1980s, like you had no escape. Like there was no digital 24/7 tradable system you could go into. You had to use the fiat currency, which was getting crushed, and there was really no way for you to escape. Like in that sense, we will see what the impact of Bitcoin is on the nation stage. We just don't really know yet. But like it is absolutely having an impact for individuals, right, and companies. It's allowing them to escape into something that cannot be controlled. That's very powerful.
So would you say, would it be safe to say that the IMF fears Bitcoin because of that? And I'm asking that question in two parts, right? Would it be safe to say that it outlived its original purpose? If they're fighting, if their supposed slogan is, the betterment of mankind, financial stability.
That's just false. I mean, that's not why they exist.
I would say 104% inflation in Argentina is a bigger threat to the lives of Argentinians than
Well, what
Bitcoin.
they'll say to you is that that's not because of their programs, it's in spite of them or whatever. They'll come up with some argument. But like the vast amount of evidence is so strong. I mean, if you just look at a chart of external debt of poor countries or third world countries or developing countries or whatever, global south, whatever you want to call out, the countries that are outside of the billion people that live in the United States and its allies, Europe, etc. Japan, their debt has gone exponential. I mean, you had a country would have maybe $100 million in external debt in the early 70s, and now it has $100 billion. I mean, that's not ever going to be possible to pay back. So this is the system they designed, was to create debt traps. And I mean, do they fear Bitcoin? I mean, I think that many staffers at these institutions don't know what Bitcoin is or don't understand it. I would say that that's probably the most prevalent thing. I would say the people in charge are wary of it. I'm not sure if they're afraid of it yet, but I think they're wary of it. They don't like it. They don't like the fact that people can escape their design with it. And that's why you've heard IMF officials be very skeptical of Bitcoin or denigrating. And that's why you see a lot of like IMF news come out and like warn El Salvador against adopting Bitcoin. Now, I think one of the reasons you haven't seen action in El Salvador is because, first of all, it's part of the system still. It's a dollarized country that still complies with the IMF and World Bank. So the Bitcoin stuff is very minimal compared to like the overall economic activity of the country. If you started to see them really move into Bitcoin, I think you might see a stronger reaction from the IMF.
So, and you were mentioning earlier about...
It's worth pointing out that Central African Republic, which...
They walked it back.
Well, you had a president that obviously liked Bitcoin, and then you had someone take advantage of him and promote this scam thing, Sango Coin, and then you had disarray, and then now they've walked it back entirely. So I don't think it's going to be like an easy road for any of these smaller, poor countries to like adopt Bitcoin. Like, I think it'll be tough.
So I want to read some of the passages from the IMF policy paper, February 2023, covering digital assets. So it goes on to say, number one was safeguard monetary sovereignty and stability by strengthening monetary policy frameworks, and do not grant crypto assets official currency or legal tender status. Number two is monitor the impact of crypto assets on the stability of the international monetary system. I mean, you can't deny that they're putting a lot of thought into this, and they definitely see it as a clear and present danger.
Yeah, I mean, I think El Salvador adopting Bitcoin was like a massive wake-up call for all these people. They were like scrambling to get up to speed. But again, I think their goal is to protect the current system, which benefits certain countries over others, and which at all costs keeps trade going, keeps everything flowing. That's like their goal. And they will do anything to get that done. I mean, they will, again, crush countries into dust to do that. I think it's fair to question, the IMF's and the World Bank's relative power today. I mean, China has its own version. China basically looked at this and they were like, we want to do that. And, their version's even worse. I mean, it's even higher interest rates and obviously a much more wicked regime. So that's certainly not the solution. But China's been lending billions of dollars to the global south also. They're not quite as influential as the bank and the fund. And because China doesn't mint the reserve currency, there's a limit to what it can do. But regional powers are going to want to do this in their own areas. Like, I wouldn't be shocked to see, Brazil doing it in Latin America or Russia doing it in Eastern Europe or Nigeria. I mean, like bigger countries are going to try to replicate this, like during the fiat system. This is like what they're going to try and do. But currently, you still have like the major creditors of the IMF and World Bank, which are the U.S., Germany, France, Japan, and England. I mean, they're gonna be, kind of pushing this the hardest. So we'll see where it goes, but the system is not meant to be disrupted. Like if you look at the voting power inside of the IMF and World Bank, it's not population based. It's based off of a colonial structure from the 40s. So, for example, Italy has more votes than China, basically, and India has less votes than Britain. It's crazy. I mean, or about the same. It's really crazy. So it's not population based. And they've minted their own currency called the SDR, which is like based on a basket of currencies. And then they distribute it. It's called a quota. It's not a loan. It's just like money that they give out.
They could print that out of thin air, couldn't they?
They could do whatever they want. But they keep printing. Obviously, it's not gonna be worth what they say it's worth. But they they print a certain amount based on what they say are reserves, right? Who knows? No one's like auditing the IMF or whatever. But let's say the reserves are there, and then they gift it to these countries based on quota. So what that means is that like 1% of all of the SDRs go to the poorest of the poor countries. So they're mainly like a subsidy or like a boost for other rich, powerful countries. It's just crazy. So it's not a very democratic system from that point of view. So it's not built to be challenged. Like the U.S. still has like a total veto on big decisions. It has more than a threshold needed to veto unilaterally, and then it also has like you need 50% to veto like a specific funding thing, and then the U.S. plus its allies have more than 50%. So like the system is not going to reform itself is the point. It's not going to. There's not going to be internal reform. Like it is designed to be a Ponzi scheme. The only possible way that these countries can pay back the debt they have is without going bankrupt, which would never be allowed, of course, is through more debt. It's not through readjustment, structural adjustment. There's only so much you can crush the economic activity out of a country. They've tried that and they failed, so they had to borrow more, and they borrow more, and they borrow more, and they borrow more, and they get into these like horrible debt traps. And the people borrowing the money are usually unaccountable dictators or corrupt officials who have no intention of personally being involved in the payback. They're just like taking the money and spending it, usually on first paying back interest, but then also weapons, military stuff, police, security forces, just whatever they can do to repress the people. They usually invest in that. And then they skim off some for themselves. They have insane wealth. And then whatever's left over maybe goes to the people, but it's like a very small percentage of what is borrowed is actually going to like actual infrastructure.
So,
and by the way, like a huge percentage of what's given goes right back to the West. This is called a double loan. So like when you look at the actual percentage of $1 billion that's given to Argentina, like a very tiny percentage of that actually goes to helping people in Argentina. Like what ends up happening first is like some of that may be used to build infrastructure, and the company that's going to come and build it is from the West. so literally the money goes right back. And there were studies done on this, and it's like for right around the 50th anniversary of the IMF and World Bank was in the early 90s, and they were looking at this, and they saw data that was basically like anywhere from 60 to 80% of the money that a country like Britain would give through one of these international financial institutions would come right back to Britain, right? So this is what's called the double loan. France would do it all the time in Africa. So France would give 100 million, like francs, let's say, or euros today to Ivory Coast. And then Ivory Coast would then hire French companies to build a whole bunch of stuff. So the 100 million would come right back to the French economy. So the France has already been paid back, but the Ivorians still owe France principal plus interest. So France ends up getting paid back, like they end up making 150 million on this deal. It's crazy. So you have the double loan dynamic is part of why there's so much drained out of the system. So you would think that you have all these rich countries over here and poor ones. You'd think that we'd be like helping them, that we'd be like, giving them some money or being charitable. In 1982, the flow of funds permanently shifted to the West. So starting with a trickle and now trillions of dollars a year, there are, this is including everything. So investment, aid, grants, loans, resources, remittances, whatever. When you just add it all up, trillions of dollars a year flow from poorer countries to richer countries. So, yeah, this model is like so broken. It would require a paradigm shift in the monetary system to change.
I wonder what that paradigm shift is. So, Alex, you mentioned something very interesting, and I want to go back to that. It's this idea that they won't allow countries to go bankrupt. I'm going to read a passage from the book. It says, quote, "One might consider bankruptcy an important and even essential part of capitalism, but the IMF basically exists to prevent the free market from working as it normally would. It bails out countries that normally would go bankrupt. What are the unintended consequences of that?"
Well, there's of course and this is what Satoshi was thinking about, obviously, when they put the Times article from January 2009 into the Genesis block, but was the moral hazard of bailouts, right? That's well known to anyone who's looked at even just domestic bailouts, right? But it goes beyond that. It's actually interesting.
But before you move
Sorry,
forward, could you tell the audience what is that moral hazard?
Well, the moral hazard is that you can be reckless and you can be whole. You can make mistakes and get bailed out. So if you know there's going to be a savior for you, if you screw up, you're going to be more risky. Okay, so moral hazard introduces a lot more risk into the system. It removes prudence. Okay, so on the global level, it means that like these governments know that they're going to get bailed out anyway. So they end up being more wasteful and corrupt and stealing a lot more. They know they're going to get bailed out anyway. And the reason why they're going to get bailed out anyway is very interesting. So when the US goes and bails out, let's say, Mexico in the 80s or 1994, or the East Asian countries in the late 90s, like when there's these big financial crises and the US comes in and does massive bailouts, like through the IMF or World Bank. We're talking billions of dollars here. They're not like the IMF didn't intervene in Mexico in the 80s and 90s for altruism. They didn't intervene to help Mexican people. They intervened because American banks had lent tons of money to Mexican institutions, and those American banks were at risk of having like a massive hole on their balance sheet, and us having a Western-style financial crisis that looked like the 1930s. So that's why the IMF came in and bailed out those banks in Mexico. It wasn't to save Mexicans, it was to save us, it was to save ourselves. So when you have a government that wants to default on a loan, ultimately that loan is an asset on a bank's balance sheet in the West, right? So that bank does not want that asset to go to zero. They would much rather extend more money, create a new loan, and then grow their balance sheet and pay for that. So that's why, for example, so Argentina had this massive amount, I think they had about $30 billion of debt that they owed to the IMF, which of course is, at the end of the day, owed to various kinds of Western creditors. Okay, so instead of like working with Argentina to figure out a way to either write that off or pay it back or whatever, they issued a $50 billion loan or something like that, the largest in history. Now that loan immediately pays back the first loan, but then generates even more debt, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, it's crazy. So we're just in this Ponzi scheme. I mean, this was well known by these officials. In the 70s, they knew this. They knew the only possible way these countries could pay back this debt was with more debt. And it gets really dangerous right now, because right now, again, to look at the connection in the international system, you have inflation in the United States, and you have the US government raising interest rates to try and tame inflation. That's like their narrow domestic prerogative. But you have insane levels of dollar-denominated debt across all these poor countries. So when the cost of capital goes up and the rates are hiked, it just crushes them. So not only do you have structural adjustment, but you also just have a general rise in interest rates across the world. Like if the U.S. is paying 3, 4, 5%, I mean, if you're Egypt, you're going to need to pay a lot more than what you were paying before. You know what I mean? So it just raises, interest rates and restricts economic activity across the world when they do this. So it's pretty tragic, and no one ever talks about that. I think it's kind of it's not part of the Fed's mandate, you know.
So Alex, when you were writing this book, you said that it was a very powerful journey. It took you from shock to disbelief to shame. But I want to focus on the last part. The last part you said, to optimism for a better future. So after everything that we just discussed just now, it's pretty dark. Why did you feel optimistic after everything that you've uncovered writing this book?
Well, what you start to realize is that these truths are well known. People have lived them. The majority of the world's people have experienced structural adjustment in some way. They survived it. They know what it's all about. They know that the IMF is bad news. So the problem was, what other option did they have? Like pre-Bitcoin, it was like, okay, so you could either like agree with the system, or you could be like an anti-American dictator, who would try to push back. And most of them were fake, meaning they would go on TV and yell about the IMF, and then they would get off TV and then they would take the money. Like this is like normal behavior. So most dictators ended up complying or reluctantly complying. Very, very few said, no, we're not working with the IMF, or screw the IMF, and some of these people who tried to resist got killed, got assassinated. I mean, I won't go into the exact specifics, but you can look at Thomas Sankara, who gave a speech at the Organization of African Unity in the 80s in Ethiopia, and he said we shouldn't pay back our debt, especially the colonial debt. It's not fair. Like we don't owe it. Tried to get countries to not pay back debt, and then he was killed and by somebody who then took control of that country, Burkina Faso, and took an enormous amount of debt. So you can draw your own conclusions from that. I mean, those are facts. So people who tried to rise up didn't really do very well. So you had these conferences in the global south for decades where it would typically be socialist type leaders getting together to yell at the US, and it's, their observations, I think, were largely true. It's sort of like economic hitman type stuff. It's largely true. Like there are exaggerations and problems in some of the arguments, of course, but like their argument is certainly at the core true. The problem is their solutions were not great. Their solutions were usually communism, socialism, or some mixture, nationalism. I mean, it's like they didn't have like a way out. You know what I mean? They couldn't go back to the gold standard. So, and they weren't. Again, a lot of this was like virtue signaling about like caring for the people. A lot of these rulers were totally corrupt. So you had this back and forth, and there wasn't really a good option. So maybe in the future you have a world where countries do have optionality. Like today, like if you're a smaller, poorer country, like you cannot print your currency to buy oil, for example, or machines or tractors for industry. You cannot. Like the company will not accept Ghanaian cedis, okay? Saudi Arabia won't accept cedis for oil, okay? And a lot of people say it's no big deal. Ghana could just go get cedis. Okay, well, how are you going to, rather, go get dollars. Okay, how are you going to get dollars? You're going to print cedis to get dollars? No, that's going to cause massive inflation in the cedi. So what they have to do is they have to structure their economy so that they can sell things for dollars. This is how it works. So they end up selling, but like America doesn't want to buy most things from Ghana. They only want to buy some things from Ghana. So it changes the whole economic structure of the country to focus on things like cocoa and coffee and tea and oil and gold and things that we want, but not things that might be good for Ghanaians, or not things that like we want competition with. So we won't buy meat or whatever. We won't buy beef from Ghana or something like that, or rice or peanuts or whatever we have like strategic interest over. We don't want them to grow. So it ends up putting them in a box where they can only where they have to really shape their country in a particular way to earn hard currency. What if you lived in a world where they could just freely exchange electricity from any source in the country for the reserve currency that could then be traded for whatever? That gets really interesting, right? Then there is no like stranglehold on this system. Then they could just create the reserve currency out of whatever electricity reserve, energy reserves they have.
What is that reserve currency, Alex?
The what? Well, this would be in a Bitcoin standard.
There we go.
Yeah, I mean, no, but this is why I'm hopeful. If Bitcoin does like complete its mission here and do what it's supposed to do and replace central banking, then you have like a world where there's just one neutral ultimate monetary good, and any country can create it with energy, and that's really cool. But most countries won't need to create it with it. I mean, the only like there won't be every country. I don't think will mine. I mean, mining will only make sense if you have cheap energy. Some countries don't really have cheap energy, and what they'll do is they'll do old school trading and export for Bitcoin, but they'll get to work in a much more open market because it won't be so rigged in terms of like, oh, we only sell things for dollars or for this currency, or no, it'll just be everybody accepts Bitcoin and like that's it. So it'll be like one monetary language for the world, and I think that's extremely optimistic.
Absolutely. Optimistic to say the least, man. Specifically because of how things have been. So one of the things that I found really interesting also in Hidden Repression is this new form of colonialism that you called green colonialism. And you go on to say industrial countries developed their civilizations by utilizing hydrocarbons, but today the World Bank and IMF try to push policies which prohibit the developing world from doing the same. And the reason I find that passage interesting too is you're hearing a lot of these environmental narratives being used to attack Bitcoin mining as well.
Well, I mean, the idea of green colonialism is based on resources. So for the longest time, Western powers stole or exploited fossil fuels from poor countries, and we use them to advance our own civilizations dramatically. Like one barrel of oil is like 500 workers. I mean, it's like a massive subsidy for what we were able to do. And there's just, it's really pernicious that not only did we steal all these fossils, but now we're telling these countries they like can't use them. It's just pretty intense. So, and not only that, but you have to use these. And I'm like very pro renewable energy. Like I love solar, wind, but it's pernicious that we say you can't use your own fossils, and you have to use this renewable tech which you have to buy from us. This is green colonialism, right? So, I mean, I think that we've seen versions of this before, right? We've seen energy policy at the global level be very one-sided. Like for the longest time, poorer countries have been forbidden from using nuclear technology. Like there were presidents and prime ministers assassinated for in big Pakistan, Brazil, etc. In large part due to their wanting to be to have nuclear power. So it's been a total sort of hypocrisy thing. I think that over time, you have a situation now where, I mean, there was an article the other day that was like praising, it was basically saying that South Africa was meeting its like emissions targets because it was load shedding, meaning like there were massive blackouts in the country. So therefore like the emissions were coming into line with what the people wanted to see. And it's like, I think there's probably a way to take care of the planet which doesn't require sacrificing poor people. That's probably the way to do it, but it's not like what they want to do, right? And the richest irony, of course, is that Germany, rich countries, when it comes down to it, they'll just use the coal immediately. So it's like, okay, we're just playing with double standards here. It's just totally insane. So I don't think Western countries should be able to dictate to poor countries what kind of energy they should use. Just like they didn't dictate to us what we could use. I think that renewable energies will be used because they make sense in a lot of these places, especially with Bitcoin mining, as you heard from Eric. Like a lot of countries have remote stranded energy that's not really, they can't really use it because it's not near a population center.
Shout out Bhutan.
Yeah, I mean, there might be hydro or volcanic or geothermal or offshore or whatever. There should be all kinds of new ways to capture energy coming out in the next decade, 2 decades. And a lot of it will just be possible to like throw a satellite connection somewhere and just monetize that energy for revenue for whatever, company, state, whatever. That will be a big help, and that's largely going to be all renewable. So I think we can just let the market work here, and Bitcoin miners are just, they're self-interested actors, and they're just going to use the cheapest energy in the world. That's all they do, is they flock to the cheapest energy. And I really do think the cheapest energy over the next 20 years is not going to be, I think fossil fuels are going to get pretty expensive. So I think if this just works the way it's heading, we're heading to a world where like most of the Bitcoin mining is actually going to incentivize, innovate, and push forward a lot of renewable stuff. So I don't think we need to have this green colonial mindset. I think it's very pernicious, and it actually reminds me of what the World Bank did in the 70s. And we had this Malthusian concept of like we had too many people on Earth. So Robert McNamara was famous for calling for basically depopulation of countries. So we encouraged and pressured or whatever India to do mass sterilization of people. You can look this up; it actually happened. So just like in the past, how we would refuse to let poor countries use good energy technology like nuclear and become independent, and just like how we tried to depopulate them, we're trying to do the same thing today. And I think Bitcoin helps break that system. So it's another reason I'm optimistic about it.
So to end it with this, Alex, right? Because we've talked about 2 alternative systems in front of us, right? We have the IMF system, and clearly we have the Bitcoin system. So my question to you is, how does Bitcoin compare to the IMF, let's use the last 2 minutes, and World Bank in terms of its potential to promote financial inclusion and empower people in developing countries?
I mean, it has... The record is clear. The IMF and World Bank have oppressed billions of people, and any advancement those countries have made has come in spite of the IMF and World Bank, not because of it. And in many cases, they have caused just massive suffering and probably the deaths of tens of millions of people. If you look at the fact that structural adjustment leads to declines in GDP that are precipitous, and that for every sort of 2% decline in GDP, your mortality rate goes up by 1%. I mean, you start doing the math, it's not pretty. So I think that the record speaks for itself on the IMF and World Bank. These are pernicious institutions when it comes to the livelihood and health and wealth of the average person in developing world and emerging market countries. And Bitcoin is a way out. I mean, we don't know where it goes from here, but we know what it is. We know it's an unstoppable, debasement-proof, open currency that's available to anybody, regardless of who they are or where they were born. And it's an open language network for money that's accessible, again, to anybody. And I think that that's going to make a big deal. It already is making a huge deal, I can assure you, to millions of individuals. I guess the question is, and we'll have to see, how does it start to impact the global monetary order? And the last thing I'll just say is that I don't think that this is bad for the United States. I think this all over time, even though the IMF confers so many benefits on us, I think that it's actually quite damaging in many ways to America and to what we stand for. And I think we can improve beyond that. And I think we can be a world power that does not vampire off of other countries. Like we can lead by example, and I think Bitcoin will help us get there. So thank you very much.
100%. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex Gladstein.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks,